There we go. All right, so thank you for all for coming to class today. This is Lee Jones. Our discussion today is about political theory. You'll remember the last discussion that we had, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago now, but the last discussion we had, we were ironing out our perhaps wrinkled understanding of the key concepts of political science. And one of those key concepts was how we understand power. What we have said so far is that politics is about power. We have also said that power is the ability to manipulate choice. We have said that the choices that matter are those that influence the allocation of scarce resources. We have said that the word scarcity is there on purpose because when we talk about scarcity, we are immediately thinking about the prevalence of conflict in the society. Why does scarcity involve conflict? Scarcity as an economic phrase means that scarcity is the inability to achieve maximum satisfaction. That means that no one is going to be able to get everything that they want. So if no one can get everything that they want, then everyone will want more than what they have received. Because people then are always going to be in a state of wanting more from the political system, then they will be into direct competition with the people who they believe received resources that they should themselves receive. So conflict is an essential concept that flows immediately from any discussion that politics is about power and the role of the government. In the best case scenario, the role of the government is to reach some type of compromise so that groups don't enter into direct competition with each other and blood flows through American streets. You see how that postulation has worked or has not worked for members of your community. So, because we're saying that politics is about power and power is the ability to manipulate choice, we come to, in this discussion, the definition of political theory. What is a political theory, right? Now, remember, we said earlier that we are we said that we are dealing with conceptual frameworks that have two focal points. On one hand, and this is from the earlier discussion, right? On one hand, you have a focal point which is centered around normative assessments. A normative assessment is what things should occur, what's the best possibility, what's the worst possible outcome, what should occur, right? A normative assessment is concerned with the ethical foundations of a thing, whether or not this thing is right and wrong. The second focal point of our conceptual framework for the class is our empiricism. We have said that the things that are observable to the five senses are the things that are real. These are the things that are true. And so your effort to analyze that which is empirical is your effort to seek out the truth of the phenomena that you are looking at. All right. So we have said that a normative assessment and an empirical assessment are the two focal points. That's from the earlier discussion that we had. All right, so now what we're doing this discussion, we are going to do political theory. One more time, we have said that politics is about power and power is about the manipulation of choice. That's what politics is. Okay. Next thing, we need to know what a theory is. You'll remember in our earlier discussion or your reading of the scientific method, we said that a theory is essentially a statement of the relationship between two or more opposing phenomena. A theory is a statement of the relationship. So just as assuredly as 1 + 1 = 2, when we take the phrase politics and we put it together with the phrase theory, we come up with the notion that a political theory is merely, no matter what else it might be, a political theory is at least a statement of the relationship between the people and their government. A theory is a relationship, a statement of the relationship between the citizens and the state. All right. Political theory becomes, let's say, political theories have the ability to mature, just like, something metastasizes in the human body. A political theory has the ability to grow and spread throughout the body politic. And so you see some other definitions down there. Political philosophy is the effort to explain the way that the state and these people interact with each other, the operations of which, right? Issues of fairness and scarcity, what have you. But we're not really getting ready to do political philosophy. And political ideology is distinct from the other two, because a political ideology is essentially a consistent set of assumptions, right? Which is different from a statement of the relationship, a set of assumptions, as in this thing is the way it should be. These people are who they are, and that this is how you should relate to them. I only offer that to you for context. What your focal point for this discussion is to understand, rather, to take in that a political theory is a statement of the relationship between the people and the state, between the citizens and their government. I'm gonna move forward a little bit. You see, we have some things in these slides about Plato's allegory of the cave. You will please read that. But let's focus our attention on political theory. There is, just like you go on to, what do you call it, when you're jumping into a pool and there's that, a jumping board, what do you call that thing? A diving board, right? Let's say you're on the diving board and you're about to jump into the pool. Well, that's what we're getting ready to do, right? We can use any political thinker, really, we can use any political thinker to dive off into a discussion of political theory. But who will we use? We'll use Marcus Garvey. You'll remember Marcus Garvey from the Universal Negro Improvement Association. You'll remember Marcus Garvey and his Black Star Line and his ability to organize African Americans, and then his ability to expand that organization into African people throughout the world, the understanding that African people throughout the world have a shared history, destiny, identity, language, culture, and such. And so Marcus Garvey then tells us that that shared identity of Black people around the world is something that you can organize around. You put a phrase on it, and then you grow organizations around it. What's that phrase? You call that Pan-Africanism. And then what kind of organizations you grow is essentially how you try to change the destiny of Black people throughout the world. All right, so that's what Marcus Garvey contributes to us. One, in his famous book, right, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Garvey tells us that a reading man and woman is a ready man and woman, but a writing man and woman is exact. Okay, so those are interesting things, right? If you want to be ready, according to Garvey, what must you do? You must read. But if you're going to be exact, what, according to Garvey, what should you do? You must write. Okay, so I offer that. I don't know if you've ever taken a class. I see Sarah Obadiah is in here. If you've ever taken a class from me, I use this phrase literally all the time. I use it with you students, and I use that thing in my daggone life, right? That helped me get my way through the degree. Okay, so now I'm offering this to you because one thing I really think you should do, let's flip through the sides and let's look at the size of the task that's in front of you, right? So look, I'm mentioning Plato. We're looking at Hobbes. We're looking at Aristotle, Jefferson. We'll look at Frederick Douglass. We'll look at Tecumseh. We'll look at Chico Mendes. We've got some Frederick Nietzsche in the house. We'll do some Kurt Vonnegut. That's Machiavelli. And then we'll look at James Madison, some John Stuart Mill. And then we'll look at religious religious fundamentalism. That's a few people that we're going to think about. How do you keep it all together? Marcus Garvey says that you should, in order to be exact, you have to write. So one thing I think you should do when you're sitting with yourself, sitting by yourself with these slides, is create a graph, right? Create a graph, and because multiple people will answer these questions. All right, more on that later. All right, so all of that was introduction. Now we'll jump right into the heart of it all, right? No more playing. This is straight to the heart of the matter. Okay, so as we investigate how political theorists throughout the ages have understood the relationship between the people and the state, we come across at least 4 existential questions of political theory. Why does political theory exist? And further, why then does the state, why does the government exist? Those four questions that we're getting ready to analyze, you see them on the screen. One, what is the purpose of the state? What is the government designed to do? Number two, what should the state promote equality? What is equality? And then should the government push that forward? The third question is, how should the state manage power? All states manage power, but what should the state be inclined to do? And then the question is whether or not the state should help people be ethical, whether or not it's up to the state to help people understand what it is to be good, right, wrong. This class is called Politics and Global Issues. All right, so let's start here. The first question is, what purpose should the state have? Let's ask the Greek philosopher Plato. You'll remember that Plato gets credit for writing. He gets credit for writing this text called the Republic. I said the phrase gets credit because some of you one day will approach this book called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James, where he argues that Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian or Kemetic philosophy. But wherever, Plato gets credit for writing this book called The Republic. And I've wanted to distill some things down with just a few bullet points so that we can get to an answer. According to Plato, what is the purpose of the state? In his book, Republic, right? Plato tells us that the goal of the state should be to pursue justice, that one of the roles of the state is to promote justice. Well, that's one way to answer it, but the question then becomes what, according to Plato, is justice? So Plato tells us that the phrase justice involves living in accord with nature, with your human nature. You'll remember with me, well, no, let's not go here first, right? So you'll say that Plato says rather that justice is living in line with the way that God created you. Plato is going to say that there are certain divisions of society, or rather society can be divided into three core groups. Plato tells us that some people are just born to be workers, manual labor, the hewers of wood and the tillers of the wheat, right? All right. And then Plato also says that some groups of people, the second group of people, are those who are born to be in the military, right? The fighters, the warrior class, and the leaders of that warrior class. And then some people are born to be the rulers. Some people are just born to be in charge of the state. For Plato then, because people are born into those three groups, if people are following their nature, then they will live in line with the group that they are born into. There's not liquidity, fluidity, that people are not moving around between groups. For Plato, you are born in that group and then you stay there. And then the purpose of the state is to promote justice by helping people be true to who they are and following their natural purpose and staying inside the group that they're born in. So I ask you, don't say anything well, I guess you don't have to, but you don't have to say anything right now, but think about the job that your parent has. Some of you might say, my parents were in the military and that is how they are funding my expedition through college. But you say, instead of going into the military, you want to have some type of job in a corporation, right? And so what would Plato say about that? Would Plato say, sure, go forward and work in a corporation when knowing full well that your parents make their living through the military? No. Plato would not say that, right? Plato would say, if your parents were military people, then you should be a military person. And then the state, rather the government, the state should help you follow the line that follow the tradition out of which you come, all right? And so back to Plato, Plato in the Republic says the just state then is one where the structure of the group is being maintained. That is what justice is. Justice is helping people to stay in the group that God birthed them in. When the state does that, then the state is acting in line with justice. When people live in line with their nature, being true to who they are and following their natural purpose, then those people then are being just Injustice as the opposite of justice. Injustice is where people look to act outside their group, act outside their nature. And the state promotes injustice when it allows this, right? You'll remember with me that Plato's Republic then is used to, let's say, justify the way American style conservatism is understood in the United States. We are getting ready to see a, let's say, a convulsion of current Trumpian conservatism in the aftermath of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Republicans saying that they're going to nominate someone else for her seat. Conservatism has a root in Plato. All right, so that's one down, right? Plato in the Republic says the purpose of the state is to promote justice, which means people are going to live in accord with their nature. And so the just state then is going to maintain the structure of the group. Let's move on to another philosopher. 1651, British political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He writes this book called The Leviathan. The Leviathan. This is a rather famous book, and one of the most famous sentences from this book is probably something you've heard expressed in popular culture. In The Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes says that people are born as individuals. Individuals have an ability through God to compete with each other, and there is no limit to that type of competition because there is no government. Hobbes says that life before government is called life in a state of nature. All right. And so Hobbes says that when two people born with the same individual rights to compete, when they come into competition with each other, the competition might become brutal. It might become a condition of war of everyone against everyone. And so the purpose of the government then is to try to step in between that competition so that people are not killing themselves in the streets and try to broker some type of compromise, some type of relationship based on the maturation of people's rights. So the famous phrase from Hobbes is to say it's not arts, it's not letters, it's not society, right? He says, it doesn't matter how much you know, it doesn't matter your standing in society, it doesn't matter what kind of education you have. Hobbes says life in a state of nature is characterized by continual fear and the danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, and it is poor, and it is nasty, and it is brutish, and it is short. Hobbes essentially says that human beings, because they're born with a God-given right to be, one, individualistic, and then second, competitive, Hobbes is saying that people here are barbarians, that people are savages without the civilizing hand of a government that will impose the law on them. Let's look at the slide that we have for Hobbes, right? So we're asking Hobbes then, what is the purpose of the state? Hobbes says that people have a violent human nature because people are selfish and then they are competitive. And so the state has to have a purpose that will allow it to correctly deal with the innate barbarism that human beings have, right? Reading through the slide. It is important to understand human nature by looking into your psyche to find your passion, your impulses, your desires. And Hobbes says when you look into that stuff, you're going to find a restless, this is a direct quote from Hobbes, a restless and perpetual desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death. That people are restlessly desiring for power after power. And because you live in a society, for Hobbes, you live in a society that is barbaric, that is brutal and solitary and savage, then it makes sense for you to try to have as much power as possible. So you see there that, you're looking into your psyche with the passions, impulses, and desires for power, and along with rationality. All right, let's look at that third bullet point together, right? Hobbes tells us that self-interest would create a common power that would forestall, that would deter people's individual aggressive tendencies. This is where the state comes from, according to Hobbes. So the state is created with the allowance for severe punishment because there is so much aggression. But the state should leave people alone if people are not being aggressive towards each other. So a good answer to the question, right? What is the purpose of the state according to Hobbes? According to Hobbes, the purpose of the state then is to provide security, to make people not be aggressive to each other. And in so doing, the state will then promote the survival of human beings. What is the purpose of the state? The state is the purpose of the state, according to Hobbes, is to promote security. You folks doing all right out there? How you doing? Let's see who's in the room. Let's pause for a minute. Y'all are somewhat quiet, but then, all right. I see, Akosua. How you doing out there, young lady? I sent you an email a few minutes, maybe an hour or so ago. I see, let me put my glasses on. What does that say? I see Aviana, I see Kaylin, Giovanni, Jeremiah, Sarah, Mac, Taia, right? Coleman, Vinka, Vinika maybe, and Wayne. Y'all folks all right? Y'all hanging with me? Say at least something in the chat box. Hey, we
It's
doing all right?
Vanika.
Wanika?
Vanika with V.
Vanika, got it, Vanika.
Yeah.
Miss Vanika, how was that? I did a little song and dance for you about Plato and Hobbes on the purpose of the state. Was that all right so far?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Makes sense.
Shall we keep on going then? I got a few more for you.
Yes.
Well, good. Let's keep on going. So we're switching our question. The book does a few interesting things, but we'll leave the question about what's the purpose of the state, and let's go here to the next question. Existential questions on the nature of political theory. The next question is, should the state promote equality? Let's start again with the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And Aristotle's writing in the book called Politica, or the book is called Politics. Now, let's just be clear, right? I don't know about you folks, but every time I say the phrase Aristotle, I immediately think that that Aristotle was rolling with Alexander of Macedonia, or Alexander the Ungreat, Alexander the Not Great, Alexander the Barbarian. Barbarian, why? Because Alexander sacked Egypt, and he actually, before they raided the libraries and burned it, right? So I'm quoting again George G.M. James' Stolen Legacy. Whenever you think about these Greek philosophers, you should feel free to read these people, because they get a lot of their understanding from ancient African or ancient Egyptian or Kemetic philosophy. Okay, let's go to Aristotle, right? The question is, should the state promote equality? Aristotle tells us that equality implies the equal consideration of interest, so that everyone's interest is promoted. What is this phrase that you would use if you're describing everyone's interest? Aristotle says then you are promoting the common interest when you are allowing for everyone's interest to be promoted in the activities of the government. Aristotle says the proper role or the purpose of the state then should be to consider the various and interfering and conflictual interests that are rolling around civil society. Consider those interests and then boil them all, distill them into a set of action items that the government can undertake. And this would be called the common interest. For Aristotle, self-serving considerations that overrule the majority and that ignore the rights of the few people, the minority, the few, these are not understood to be correct considerations for the purpose of the state, right? These would be incorrect. These would be undue things for the state to engage in. Now, remember that for Aristotle, where he says equality, he doesn't mean equality as we are, tend to think about it nowadays, right? Nowadays, when we think about equality, we're saying that everyone should have equal access to the vote. We're saying that the unequal distribution of wealth in the society should have some type of limits. We're saying that hungry people in America should be fed, right? Or some people are saying equality means corporations should be able to use their wealth in an unfettered use their wealth as, however they wish, right? To whatever ends they wish. Now, what Aristotle is saying is that when he says equality, he means to talk about equality of result. We want to make a distinction between equality of participation, that tends to be the normal understanding, and then equality of result. For Aristotle, the state will supposedly consider the interests that people have, and remember those interests are in competition with each other, and then for Aristotle, the state sets up an agenda items, an agenda of items that it will engage in, and because this agenda item will promote the best interest for society, then those agenda items are understood to be equal, are understood to produce rather equality. I'm just trying to boil it down nice simple terms there, right? That Aristotle book. All right, so then for Aristotle in the book Politics, right, the good state is the one that promotes the public interest, the interest of the many, and the interests of the few are supposed to be equally represented in this conception. All right. The good state promotes the public interest, not most of the public, but in the best case scenario, the entirety of the public. So for your notes, should the state promote equality according to Aristotle? The answer is yes, where equality means the equal consideration of people's interests. Let's move on to the next philosopher. I'm gonna stop talking at the 15 before the hour. So I have another 15 minutes to go. Let's keep on going. Now we're asking again, should the state promote equality? We're moving away from the Greek classics, and we'll go into some American so-called classics, right? Let's approach Thomas Jefferson. You'll remember with me that Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, wrote was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. Remember with me, we have read our Lerone Bennett Jr. and Thomas Jefferson. We know, okay, so Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence writes one of the most famous sentences in all of American history, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and amongst these are life, liberty, and Jefferson said, the pursuit of happiness, or what he meant was the right to hold private property. Now, remember with me the famous historian Lerone Bennett Jr. in his book called Before the Mayflower, where Lerone Bennett Jr. tells us that while Thomas Jefferson was writing that phrase, all men are created equal, that he was being attended to by an enslaved black man derisively named Jupiter. And that Jupiter, as a child, when they both were children, that Jefferson as a slaveholder was given Jupiter, and Jupiter went to grade school with him, went to college with him, and Jupiter was very likely, according to Lerone Bennett Jr., was very likely in the room when Thomas Jefferson wrote that most famous sentence on the nature of freedom. He was being attended to by an enslaved black man. All right, so we still need to read Thomas Jefferson, right? So Thomas Jefferson, we're asking him the question, should the state promote equality? Looking at the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson tells us that equality indicates an equality of natural rights. Remember, he said that you are born with certain inalienable rights, and amongst these are life, liberty, and the right to hold property, where Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. All right, so this leads us to four intersecting points. Thomas Jefferson, should the state promote equality? Individuals are born not only free, but people are born equal to each other, right? And so people who are equal to each other have equal rights that the government did not give you, and therefore the government cannot take them away. Now, you still need government. Remember, Jefferson is a student of Hobbes and the Leviathan, but what's the purpose of the government? According to Jefferson, the government should be there to protect people's rights. And remember, the Declaration of Independence is an exercise in the Enlightenment philosophers' notions called social contract theory. And the conclusion of social contract theory, you see it reflected in point number 4, where because social contract theory is inside the Declaration of Independence, it makes sense for us to note that while people give up some of their rights to create a government, and that government is supposed to protect people's rights, if the government winds up violating instead of protecting people's rights, then the people have the power, the right, the necessity to overthrow that government and to create a new government that will better protect their rights. So according to Jefferson, if the question is, should the state promote equality, then we say, Jefferson says that yes, the state should promote equality, and it does that by protecting people's rights. People's rights are inalienable, that the government didn't give them to you, so the government cannot take them away from you. Where do you get your inalienable rights from? You get them from God. And if God gives you something, who can take it away? I recall the reggae artist named Sanchez, right? Where he said, do 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 do. Sanchez said, Jah is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? No other man. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, right? So Jefferson here is telling us that if God gives you something, no one can take it away. That includes the government. So the purpose then of the government is to protect your rights. The government promotes equality by protecting the rights of the people. That's Thomas Jefferson. Let's keep on going. This next slide here, I'm comparing Aristotle to Jefferson. You'll read that. Now, let's ask some other people. Now, let's be clear about what your book is doing. You should be reading that book. You should absolutely be reading that book. You want to maximize your chances to get an A on this next quiz. Then your goal, if you haven't read it already, is to read, I think, chapters 3 and 4. You want to read the chapter on types of power, and you want to read the chapter on political theory. You should read that stuff. Now, when you read your book, you're going to find that there is a paucity, there is a lack of Black authorities that the book quotes, right? And so in order for us to make this class be what we need to give us a sense of power that we can use to move forward, we're going to bring into the discussion Frederick Douglass. You'll remember with me Frederick Douglass, the orator, the theorist, the abolitionist, the women's suffragist. It's Frederick Douglass who shows us not only, Frederick Douglass shows us, right? But 100 some odd years before the example of Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass shows us that you are not confined to the circumstances in which you are born. Right? Frederick Douglass was born trapped inside slavery. However, he changed his circumstances and then educated himself and becomes one of the foremost African-American thinkers of the 19th century. One of the most famous phrases Frederick Douglass uttered, listen to it with me, right? Read it with me, right? Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Boom, boom, boom. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation, these are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its mighty waters, right? Those who want progress without struggle are like the students who want an A without study. Frederick Douglass said, that was a joke. Frederick Douglass says the struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Frederick Douglass tells us that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Let's ask Frederick Douglass then, should the state promote equality? any read of Frederick Douglass, you'll find that just one of the things he's known for is pointing out the inadequacies of the abolitionist movement, pointing out the crimes that were occurring during the conclusion of the Reconstruction period. Frederick Douglass tells us then that there is a long train of white abuses against Black people in civil and economic rights, and these things are just plainly self-evident on the face, prima facie, right? For Frederick Douglass, then, this is evidence of discrimination, these white abuses against Black people. This discrimination should force a moral imperative on the nation, meaning it demands action. A moral imperative means that there's something so wrong that you should not be able to just sit back and just observe it, right? That a moral imperative means this thing is so wrong and you are witnessing it, then you have a responsibility to rise up and do something about it. So the nature of discrimination demands action because it does force a moral imperative. For Frederick Douglass, the very nature of discrimination present for Black people is the absence of equality. It is some other things, but for our purposes here, it's the absence of equality. Frederick Douglass, 100 years before the Memphis sanitation workers did their strike, and they were carrying those signs saying, "I am a man, I am a man." 100 years before that, I've got an essay over here where Frederick Douglass proclaims that Black people are human beings, that he had to prove that, assert rather, that Black people are people and human beings have rights just like white people have, right? And so for Frederick Douglass, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, the very Constitution itself, these American documents which purport to hold up values for whites, these things have to uphold the same values for Blacks, because if they do not, according to Frederick Douglass, which then is also according to the whole of the civil rights movement, that if they do not, then the very rights that white people use to discriminate against Blacks are in peril. He's saying here, Frederick Douglass is saying that if one person does not have rights, then no one has rights. That if one person is being discriminated against, then everyone is being discriminated against. You'll remember this was echoed by Martin Luther King Jr., about 80 years later, where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, because we are caught in we are tied in a garment of mutuality and such. All right, let me keep going. So for Frederick Douglass here, should states promote equality? Frederick Douglass says the goal of the state should be to end discrimination. The state then becomes the guarantor of civil rights. And when it does this, then the state should promote equality. Frederick Douglass answers the question, yes, the state should promote equality. All right, let me maximize 2 more minutes. Let's do one more. Now we go from the African-American theorist Frederick Douglass. Let's move into the Native American theorist, the Shawnee mystic, the Indian military leader, Tecumseh, or Tecumseh. I'm gonna say Tecumseh, right? Tecumseh, right? Tecumseh, excuse me, he once said, "No tribe has the right to sell, even to each other, much less to strangers, sell a country." Tecumseh, "Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Didn't the Great Spirit," meaning God, "didn't the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? The only way to stop this evil is for the red man to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land, as it was first and should be now, for it was never divided. We gave them forest-clad mountains and valleys full of game, and in return, what did they give our warriors and our women? Rum, trinkets, and a grave." Tecumseh is answering the question, should the state promote equality? For Tecumseh, the equality means equal access to property. Equality means the equal ability to own and then benefit from the produce of the land. For Tecumseh, equality means equal property rights. This is the same thing as saying natural rights, and he's saying that the right to the land of their ancestors is interchangeable with their natural rights. Remember with me that Tecumseh is a mystic. He is a religious leader. He is a spiritual guide, and he says that there is a spiritual force that put Native Americans on the land not to own it, but to live in oneness with that land. And so when Native American leaders throughout in the history of their interaction with white settlers, when Native American leaders made treaties with these settlers, and the result of that treaty was that Native Americans lose their trusteeship over the land. Well, Tecumseh calls that a form of appropriation, where the word appropriation means theft. Tecumseh says the land has to be returned, and because the Great Spirit gave them the land, and their leaders have no right to give it to the whites, and whites definitely had no right to take it away from the Native American leaders. So to answer the question, should the state promote equality? Tecumseh says, yes, the state should promote equality. And by equality, we're talking about equal access to the land or property rights. All right, so we're at 45 minutes after the hour. I'm a